Connie Mitchell, Captain, Chaplain, Georgia State Defense Force. I am working on my PhD in counselor education and supervision. I do have a master's in counseling. So I am specializing in crisis and trauma, and I've done a lot of research and presentations on suicide prevention, and also did a part of my internship in suicide awareness class, and also done a lot of grief work on research on grief and presentations. So that's me. So today we're going to talk about soldier wellness and suicide prevention. An overview of what we're going to talk about is stress, PTSD, suicide, and the risk factors, warning signs about suicide, and how to help, how we can intervene. Okay, and we all use the word stress, but just to give it a definition and the origin is, I don't do death by PowerPoint where I'm going to read the whole PowerPoint to you, but there's a couple of things. If I'm reading it to you, then it's important. But when, or I feel it's relevant, when stress reaches excessive proportions, psychological changes can be so dramatic as to have serious implications for both mental and physical health. Trauma changes your brain. Stress can change your brain. And it was a med student who started noticing when patients would come in that no matter what the reason for them being there, they would have similar issues. And that regardless of the stimulus, regardless of the stressor, they all had, headaches, high blood pressure, or whatever. And so that's how he came up with the word to identify it, or to group them all together, was to use the word stress. And a psychosocial stressor is not what happens to you that matters, but how you take it, how you react to that stress, how you process it. Stress-related diseases, we could probably identify with some of these as ulcers, whether it's stomach ulcers, colitis ulcers, irritable bowel syndrome, a lot of digestive issues related to stress, and heart issues, and even allergies and asthma. Psychological response to stress, how we react, how our body responds psychologically, is anxiety, depression, insomnia, and psychiatric disorders. And as mentioned earlier by Chaplain Fleming, we do have a certain level of stress in the Defense Force. We don't carry arms, but we are involved in missions that can be stressful. We are involved in situations that can be stressful. We were talking last night, has anybody been on any search and rescue real world missions? And I was at OIC at a mission over in Rabun County in Clayton, and there wasn't a chaplain there that first day, and the family was there because the guy went out into the woods hunting by himself with his dogs. He had a Diet Mountain Dew, and he had diabetes, and he only took one day's worth of insulin with him. And so we went out there searching for him, and it was several days later where they brought in the dogs and they found his body. But that first day, there wasn't a chaplain out there, but I was sitting there with the family, and they were believers, and I sat there to be a comfort and be a presence and minister to them. And the first time I went out on a mission, and this is when God gave me the idea or the desire to do presentations and to implement crisis disaster training within the Defense Forces, because it was 2011, there was a tornado in Lamar County that wiped the area out. They had to show me in the cul-de-sac where the homes used to be, and there was a guy in his early 20s that was walking around like he was in shock because his aunt and uncle were and another relative were all killed. And the article, you could Google it, and it said a similar statement about him being in shock, but the little girl says Mama blew away, and I think it was her grandmother who had adopted her, and but she said Mama blew away because the tornado took her. And so we were responding to that situation to clean up, but there was no chaplain there. There was no mental health presence. There was no counselors there. to minister to the psychological and emotional needs. And what I'm standing here doing now is birthed out of that, which was back in 2011. So some of the mission implied tasks that we do in the State Defense Force is search and rescue, disaster recon, and just augmentation, shelter augmentation. We've responded to a lot of different missions. Hurricane Katrina, that was before I came in. I came in 2009. And Meredith Emerson, that was a missing person. Then Haiti, earthquake, they actually flew in people from Haiti that were devastated from the earthquake. And then Barnesville tornado, that was the one I was referring to in Lamar County. And then Hurricane Matthew and Michael. And some of the stressors that I'm aware of that soldiers have encountered since I've been in is the death of soldiers. I used to do the history mission, and we go to the history office and help with all the archives and items. And one of the main guys that was there years later had gotten out of his vehicle in '75 to help a somebody that was stalled on the interstate. And he got out and he put on his safety vest and got around to help him. And it was like 7:30 in the morning, and an SUV plowed right into him and killed him. And there's several others that have died through cancer or died in their sleep with, no medical issues, but they died nonetheless. And other spouses, children, relatives, and or medical issues, divorce, job loss, and any of those types of issues or suicide. I've seen that in the Defense Force since I've been in. So it's not just combat military that, it's associated really with PTSD. People think PTSD military, but it's not just the military that encounters PTSD. It could be military combat. You could be in the military and not have seen combat but still have PTSD. Or sexual assault, man-made natural disasters, accidents. All those are, even the potential danger or your life is threatened could create PTSD. And the diagnostic criteria is the DSM states that people not directly endangered but who witnessed the event or the aftermath of the event. And this was when I had taken a combat PTSD training class. I saw this, but it didn't really do a lot for me when I first saw it. It said people who have learned that a loved one was exposed to a life-threatening event or sexual violence never in personal danger themselves, and the death must have been violent or accidental. Well, my parents were in a head-on collision in the middle of my grandmother's funeral, and my father was killed instantly. And so when I read that, I just flew over it, and I'm like, well, I don't have PTSD. Well, I made it through 2 textbooks, and I still didn't see it. But then when I got to Chris Adzit Combat Healing Trauma Manual, and it was actually fill in the blank, it totally ministered to me, and I was writing all over it. And at the back of the book, it says if you have 4 out of 9 of these symptoms, you might need to seek professional help. And I had already been to a counselor for 9 years at this point, but it wasn't relevant to PTSD. It was going to the Christian counselor as I was taking care of my mom. And so, but when I looked at that list, if you have 4 out of the 9, well, I had all 9. And so I texted my counselor and I took a picture of it. I said, well, I guess I really needed counseling. And it was just God using that book to show me that I really did have it. But it really didn't show up until after my mother died. I took care of her for 9 years, and I moved her to a personal care home for 2 years. And it was the trauma of my dad dying, taking care of my mom, and watching. My dad was a sudden death, tragic, and my mom was slow, debilitating. You get to watch and experience grief every day. And so, that, I finally realized, especially like probably 6 months after my mom died, is when I really started feeling the PTSD, and it was coming up. And we buried her 4 years ago today, actually, because it was on the 26th when she went to go see Jesus. My mama loved Jesus, So I wasn't full of grief when it happened. I was totally relieved that she no longer was suffering and she was with Jesus. Because my mama said, I know this, she goes, I feel like Jesus loves me more. She goes, I know this isn't true, but I feel like Jesus loves me more than anybody. I'm his favorite. And I'm like, what would happen if we all, felt like that? But it was through all that, after she died, about 6 months, that all the PTSD stuff started coming up. But it's the most common mental health diagnosis in the VA. The Vietnam veterans suffer a lot through a whole lifespan of PTSD. And it was actually it was called, I don't know if I have it in this PowerPoint, but it was called different names. It was called, one thing during the Civil War. They changed it up during, World War I, and then World War II. And I can't even remember, if y'all can remember them. Shell shock. Combat fatigue, yeah. And so, but then it was in 1980, after Vietnam, when they finally gave it the recognition that it needed in order to get the veterans the help that they deserved and needed, that they identified it and put it in the DSM as post-traumatic stress disorder. It's the stress and the trauma that you experience after the incident. Like after I took care of my mom, then it all, as my dad would say, the crap hit the fan. And then I started experiencing the trauma. But it's an anxiety disorder, so my anxiety was off the chart. So it was 3 years ago, yesterday, that I had the worst anxiety attack I ever had in my life. And it was, I felt like and it was short, but it was the worst anxiety attack. So it's an anxiety disorder. It's intrusive thoughts, re-experiencing the trauma, and avoiding behaviors and reminders of the event, negative thoughts and moods, hyperarousal, and military combat trauma is prevalent cause of PTSD. But I could sit there and tell you every little thing that happened the day of the wreck. I could tell you what I ate for breakfast. I could tell you what I wore. And when we were at the hospital with my mom, my sister kept saying, "Oh, Connie, don't forget your dress." Well, I was trying to forget my dress because I had it in my little hospital bag on top of the closet. I wasn't going to wear that dress again. Why am I going to wear the dress again that every time I wear it, I'm going to be, oh, this is the dress I had on at my grandmother's funeral when my dad was killed. So I just had to throw the dress away. So emotional reactions are anger, irritability, sadness, physical reaction, increased heart rate, high blood pressure, digestive problems sleeping. Behavioral reactions, alcohol, drug use, emotional, physical abuse, isolating, avoiding places and activities. What's interesting is that we all have, this is a rabbit trail, but we all have attachments. Based on your childhood, you had secure attachments or insecure attachments, because you had a secure relationship with your mom, your dad, or you had insecure where you felt abandoned by them even though they were there, maybe they weren't there. You've developed those attachments one way or the other. So I had great relationship with my parents and I had secure attachments, but the trauma, and it took me a while to work through this and figure it out and everything. And I talked to my advisor and I asked him, is this really a thing or what? Because it's like God is helping me figure it out. And I didn't even know if it was legit. But all of a sudden, instead of, like, people with PTSD don't want to be around people. They want to isolate. Well, my secure attachment was all of a sudden insecure. And so when I developed a new friendship after the wreck, or, years later after, moving my mom to a personal care home, all of a sudden I had all these insecurity issues that I never had dealt with before and didn't make sense to me. And so I finally, kept praying about it and looking for articles and everything else. And I finally asked my advisor professor, and he says, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. It's just the flip side of the coin. It was the Holy Spirit telling me, but he just confirmed it. And later I actually found an article that said that your secure attachment can change to an insecure attachment because of trauma. So it wasn't just me, thinking I must be crazy. So cognitive reactions, poor concentration, flashbacks, nightmares, problems with short-term memory. And when I say it showed up after my mom, is that I was in the class and this was 6 months after, and we were supposed to work on what our dissertation topic was going to be. So I started looking for articles about caregivers, and while I was looking at the articles, it said responsibilities of caregivers. And I was just reading the list that I did for 9 years of my life, and I fell apart. I mean, I just totally fell apart. And I'm like, this is not normal. I'm just reading this article and this list, and I just was an emotional wreck. And so as soon as I recovered, I started Googling it to see if this was is this a thing? And it said, yeah, caregivers of dementia and Alzheimer's experience symptoms of PTSD. And I won't go with the videos. It's just a VA video that explains like an animated version of what PTSD is. But basically, your brain, when you get hyperarousal, you're in the fight or flight, normally all those hormones, cortisol and all that calms down and chills out, but yours doesn't shut off. The foot is on the gas pedal and you're wide open, right? You said, Chaplain Fleming said he liked to drag race. My dad was a drag racer before he met my mama, but my mama didn't like it, so he didn't do it no more. But that's like being wide open on the drag strip, and you can't stop it. You can't do anything to shut it off. So I had symptoms that were unrelated that were flaring. I mean, I wasn't there at the wreck. I didn't hear the sounds. My trauma wasn't involved in noise, but I had a high aversion to drama. So I thought maybe that was it, and I was at Dollar General, not right near my house, and I was getting ready to back out, and this ambulance pulled up, and the EMTs were getting ready to walk into the store. And they turned around, and they got a call on the radio, so they jumped back in the car, and I had just rolled down my window, and I was pulling out of the Dollar General. Then all of a sudden the siren went off, and that freaked me out. And I started crying, and I had a big reaction that didn't make sense. And I was hitting the steering wheel, and I just busted out crying. And I texted my counselor, and I said, and I wasn't going to counseling anymore because Jesus was specific and gave me a dream and interpretation about letting that go so I could go deeper in Him. And so in that moment, and I texted her, and she goes, it makes sense, because if you have PTSD, all of your senses are on high alert. It didn't really matter whether the noise thing was part of my personal trauma. Everything was on high alert. Everything was full open, wide open. All of my emotions, all of my senses were on overload. So secondary PTSD is you bring your trauma home, and that trauma is basically emotional throw up on everybody that surrounds you. Or if you don't get the support that you think you should get as a caregiver, if your siblings, if your family members, if your friends all of a sudden peace out because they don't want to deal with your new role as a caregiver, or they're not being supportive, then that's your expectation of them helping you doesn't match up with reality. Then you're in an angst. Then that's secondary trauma. If you were abused, if you were raped, and nobody believed you, or if you had to repeat that trauma on the witness stand, that's secondary trauma. That's secondary PTSD. As far as military, it's the spouse that's at home that suffers from that, or the children that can suffer from that. But stigmas, there's a lot of mental health stigmas in the military, and that keeps people from seeking the treatment and getting the help that they need. And common stereotypes, believing that, they all have PTSD, or it's their own fault because they're the ones that signed up for the military, stigmas like that. Or they're worried about losing their rank, losing their security clearance. not getting their promotion. You know, that's why they don't want to seek out the help that they need. And PTSD is not about what is wrong with somebody, but it's what happened to someone. So educating someone on PTSD, somebody that's experiencing, educating them on PTSD, education is very helpful to know that I'm really not going crazy. I feel like I'm going crazy. I got signs and symptoms that I'm going crazy, but I'm really not, because this is something that happened to me, and this is the way trauma rewired my brain. And so I would say, okay, Jesus, I thank you for rewiring my brain. Trauma may have rewired my brain, but I thank you that you're going to rewire my brain so it's back to the way you designed and created it to be. Okay, moral injury, and I'm not sure where it's at in my book, but before I did a presentation on counseling veterans, and there's a really excellent example in this book. So instead of just reading this to you, basically a moral injury is you have basically a moral, spiritual conviction about what you're going to do or not going to do in combat. And you have a leader that you may feel like betrayed you because they asked you to do something that was against your morals. Or you let down your guard, you let down your standard, and you did something that you feel like was morally wrong. So an example is, in the book, Counseling Veterans, is this young guy comes in, he goes, hey, I feel like I have PTSD. He's like, well, you have hyperarousal, what's going on? He's like, well, no, that's not it. Do you have a lot of guilt? You know, what's going on? And so he says, well, no, it's not that. He says, were you in combat? The counselor says. And he's like, oh, no, I basically had a cushiony job. I was out in, was it Arizona, New Mexico, and I was a drone operator. So it felt like I was playing video games. And then I'd get off of work and then go out to eat with my buddies and go home. So it was a cushioning job. But the problem is, one day, my commander told me to do a drone strike, and as soon as I did it, I saw a little boy kicking the soccer ball. So that drone strike was on a village with women and children. So he couldn't get over the guilt and the moral injury of what he did and what his commander asked him to do. So that's an example of what a moral injury is psychological trauma based on circumstances or events that were harmful to other people, moral conviction that you have, you felt that it was wrong. Unintentional errors, transgressive acts of others. Okay, to assess for PTSD, it's the intensity of the symptoms, or if somebody resulting in that PTSD, now they're experiencing depression and talking about suicide or attempting suicide. And comorbidity is a big word that just means two things going on at one time. That somebody could have PTSD, but they're also abusing drugs to try to deal with their trauma. Or somebody has a traumatic brain injury and they have PTSD. Those combined, basically perfect storm, a combination like that, that's a higher risk for somebody to attempt or consider suicide. In military suicides, it's an average to 20 to 22 veterans who die by suicide a day. And there's a Facebook page called Mission, and an organization called Mission 22. So I guess it was the year before last, I decided they have a push-up challenge. And so every day you do push-ups for 22 push-ups a day. So God just inspired me to do the videos along with it because other people were doing it. I'm like, okay, well, let me just be real. And so that was the first time my family ever heard me say anything about PTSD. And I was talking about it in the videos, and I raised over $1,000 for the Mission 22 And it was several months later, they actually sent me this huge wooden flag in the middle of it. It says Mission 22. But it's bringing awareness to veterans suicide and how to prevent and to stop veteran suicide. But just to go through the myths, because a lot of times it's hard to bring up those subjects because it's uncomfortable. But you've seen the meme on Facebook, I'd rather you talk to you now than go to your funeral later. And there's so many people in the news and that are famous that die by suicide, and people are like shocked. And it's not always that they didn't see the warning signs, because sometimes I can't remember her last name, but she was Miss America, and her first name's Cheryl, and she looked like she had it all together. And when my niece, I think she was doing her discipleship training school, and I texted to her, and she was crying and upset because she looked up to her as a role model. My niece is biracial, and Miss America was African American, so she was a great role model for young people. But as soon as and she jumped from a 60 foot or 60 floors from I don't know if it was in New York or where it was at. And I'm like, something's gonna come out, because everybody acted shocked. Nobody knew why. And so finally, a few months later, I saw the article, and the mother shared the text that came out. She hid it from her own mother. The woman who gave birth to her and was her biggest support, her biggest cheerleader, she had a great relationship with, but she hid that depression from her mom because she didn't want to she bought into the lie that if I share this with my mom, I'll be a burden to my mom. So her mom, she hid it so well, her own mother didn't know it. So she's basically an outlier, that she didn't have any symptoms, because even people would go back and watch her interviews, and she didn't give any signals that she had symptoms. So that's the scary one right there. But myth number one, if somebody really wants to die by suicide, he or she will find a way to do it. And that's not true. Greatest evidence that death by suicide is preventable is limiting access to lethal means. And I've given this example before. It was over, I believe, in Great Britain, and I think it was after World War II. They had a high rate of suicide because the gas level in the apartments were really high. And so if people got stressed out, oh, I'm going to kill myself, they would stick their head in the oven and they would die. Well, then there was no regulation on the amount of gas coming out. And so the government put regulators on it and brought it down. So the suicide rate went down. So they didn't run out and go find another way to kill themselves. They were able to calm down in that moment and not kill themselves. So that's a myth that they'll just go find another way. Because if you can create that space and give somebody time to be able to calm down and help them process in that moment, in that brief moment of crisis, then you can help save a life. Myth number two, asking about suicidal thoughts or plans leads someone to take their life. That's not true. If you ask somebody, then you're actually giving them permission to talk about it. You're telling them that you're not scared to have that conversation. You're actually creating a safe environment and a safe space in order for them to have that conversation. There's talkers versus doers is myth number three. In other words, people that talk about it really don't do it. Well, that's not true either. Some people are trying to give you warning signs by talking about it. So suicidal threats should always be taken seriously. If somebody says, you'll be sorry when I'm dead, or I can't see my way out of it, if somebody that feels hopeless, that's a big sign of they might be considering suicide. Myth number four, a person won't die by suicide if they just made plans to take a vacation, or they had young children, or know how much they loved. That's not true. Because if you look at Naomi Judd, who the whole world loved her. Her daughter in an interview said she bought the lie because she couldn't, and she had, and in an interview, Naomi Judd said that she had basically non-treatable depression. In other words, they tried every single thing that they could possibly try, and they could not cure her depression. She was that severely depressed. So in her own mind, she wasn't good enough. In her own mind, she wasn't loved, but the whole world loved her. But she couldn't get past that mental health issue, that chemical imbalance, that lie that she wasn't worthy. Risk factors could be mental disorders, mood disorders, or a family history of suicide could be a risk factor, or a previous attempt, or somebody that just recently had a physical illness, or major physical illness, or a financial loss, a job loss, or something. You know, when the crash, was it 1928, the Great Depression, stock market crash, there were people flying out the window because they had lost everything and they were jumping to their death. And more risk factors are a cluster of suicide and a lack of social support, isolation, cultural, religious beliefs about suicide. And just an acronym to help others is SAVE. And that's signs, ask, validate, and encourage. You want to validate someone, not tell them, oh, it's no big deal, you'll find another job. You just, minimize their pain. You weren't validating them. And you want to encourage them to get treatment, but you want to go with them to get treatment. You don't want to just say, oh, I hope you make it, but no, you want to walk with them, take them to the hospital or make that phone call. But signs are hopelessness, anxiety, agitation, feeling trapped like there's no way out, no reason to live, anger, rage, abuse of drugs or withdrawing, or giving their stuff away. And says seek medical attention or emergency intervention if you think they have an immediate plan. You're concerned that they have an immediate intervention is needed right now. And ask the direct question is, bless you, are you thinking about killing yourself? That's a direct question. Versus, you're not thinking about killing yourself, are you?
Because it says on the instrument.
Well, that's a very judgmental statement. Because, yes, it is yes or no, but it's judgmental. Oh, no, I wouldn't do that. So you've shut the door. Right? They don't feel safe to have that conversation with you because you just asked them in a judgmental way. But allow yourself time to talk about it. Don't wait till you got five. Like if you were counseling a soldier and you're talking to them, don't wait until you got 5 minutes left before you got to go somewhere and then bring it up. And then you don't have that time to pour into them, time to give them, when then you're making it worse. Because now I'm really not valuable because you don't care enough to stay around and find out the answer. So major predictions of actual suicidal behavior is, do they actually have a plan? And available means to follow through with that plan and implement it. The lethal means, most veterans who die by suicide use a gun. Do they have previous attempts? And what resources are available? But specific, added some suggestions for specific questions to ask. Some of these are to detect the suicidal behavior, and so they're kind of the negative, direct question, but the others are positive take on the questions. So have you been thinking about hurting or killing yourself? When did you last think seriously about completing suicide? And do you have the means? Have you attempted at suicide before? And has anyone in your family? These are all questions you can ask. What are the odds that you will leave here and kill yourself? But the two positive takes or the strength-based questions are what's been keeping you alive so far? You know, what do you think the future holds for you? To try to build on their strengths and focus on the strengths instead of focusing on the weakness. And like I said earlier, validate. This one I don't think had the one about the listening, but the other presentation does. But make sure you're listening and you're not doing all the talking, because you're not validating somebody if you're telling them what your Uncle Joe did, 35 years ago. You're not validating them if you're monopolizing the conversation. They need somebody that cares enough to listen, somebody that cares enough to be present. Okay? You want to encourage and expedite them to get the help that they need if you're in a crisis situation. And this was a video specifically about suicide attempt survivors, and they were talking about, with some of them they had extreme depression, extreme mental health issues, where every day the interviewer or reporter asked, "How does your family trust you?" And he said, "They don't. Every day I wake up and don't know if I'm going to do it or not. But I'm trying to live one day at a time." And National Suicide Prevention just came out with a 3-digit code. It just happened this month. It was July 16th, I believe, and it's 988. So instead of having to memorize a whole phone number or a whole song that has the phone number in it, call 988, and that's the suicide prevention hotline. So any questions?
Do you know why 988?
Don't know, they picked it.
That's really good information.
Yes, I don't know why they chose those numbers, but it's a 3-digit number to try to, that it routes you to the main number.